Hi guys, good morning. So I figured we need to cover poetry even if I am not going to be there today. So because we are a bit behind, so I'm going to go on with I Find No Peace quickly, and I'll try and get through this as quickly as we can so that we can finish up the poetry series. I mean the sonnet section of the poetry. Okay, so I Find My Peace is a poem by Sir Thomas Wyatt. As you know, it's a sonnet, and you can see that it's one of the earlier sonnets. And because it's much earlier, 1500s, you may expect it to be closer to the original sort of Italian sonnets, the Petrarchan sonnets, so we're expecting a volta. And if we look down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, then we do not really see any conjunctions here, which is a little bit surprising perhaps, but you might say that there's a bit of a change in direction. However, if there is a change in direction, it's very minor. So let's take a read through the poem and see what we can say about it. I find no peace, and all my war is done. I fear and hope. I burn and freeze like ice. I fly above the wind, and yet I cannot rise. And naught I have, and all the world I season. That loseth, nor locketh, holdeth me in prison, and holdeth me not, yet can I scape no wise, nor letteth me live, nor die at my device, and yet of death it giveth me occasion. And without iron I see, and without tongue I plain. I desire to perish, and yet I ask health. I love another, and thus I hate myself. I feed me in sorrow, and laugh in all my pain. Likewise displeases me both life and death, and my delight is causer of the strife. Okay, so you'll remember that our central focus of sonnets is generally the unrequited love idea, especially in the early sonnets, and I think we can see this quite strongly here. So number one thing I want to point out right from the beginning is that we have a number of contradictions. You might call them paradoxes. So I find no peace, and all my war is done. So there is no peace, yet war is over. Paradox 1. Paradox 2. I fear and I hope. On one hand, fearing. Oh dear, what's going on? Okay, fear. And on the other hand, we have hope. We've got burning, and we have freezing. And this takes place within the simile like ice, which is quite interesting as well. Probably quite a good simile there. Paradoxically, ice can burn your skin if it is too cold, frostbite and so forth, although not literal burning, of course. I fly above the wind, yet I cannot rise. I mean, flying above the wind is very exaggerated anyway. And yet I cannot rise. I think this should be not a rise, but rise. I fly above the wind, yet can I not rise. Yeah, so I fly above the wind, yet can I not rise. Arise would add an extra syllable there that doesn't seem to work, so I'm going to cut that out. I think it might have been a transcription error. Okay. And naught I have, and all the world I season. Season here is an interesting word. Yeah, you can unpack that in a number of ways, but the idea that that he influences the whole world is quite interesting. Season, as in seasoning with seasoning food, for example, might be an interesting reading. So I have nothing, and yet I influence the world, or I experience the whole world. that loseth nor locketh holdeth me in prison. Okay, so nothing that looses or locks holds him in prison. And holdeth me not, yet can I escape no wise. So this is an interesting word here as well. The things that lose or which loose hold him in prison, and yet he is not held. He is not held, he or she. And although not held, he can escape. He cannot escape. Nor letteth me live, nor die at my device. So it doesn't let me live, but it doesn't let me die at my choosing. I can't choose to die, but I can't live either. And yet of death it giveth me occasion. Anyway, and yet it gives me the opportunity for death, or perhaps even the desire. It gives you the occasion to think about death, perhaps, or the desire for it. And yet of death it giveth me occasion. Without eye I see, without eyes I see, and without tongue I plain. So how can you see without eyes? How can you complain or without a tongue? This is probably complain, but it could also be I explain, I voice my concerns. I desire to perish, and yet I ask health. Just every line is basically a paradox, as you see. Let me just highlight all of these for you. I love another, and thus I hate myself. And here's the I think the crux of the matter, perhaps, that we're finally seeing. The problem is that in loving another, perhaps feeling uncomfortable with the self, the speaker describes it says that they hate themselves because they love another. And this is sort of very typical of the Petrarchan sonnets. I'm so tied up with somebody that I hate myself. I'm bound to this person, and because I am bound to this person and I cannot sort of move on or think about anything else, I feel like I am paradoxically both burning and freezing, fearing and hoping. There is no conflict, and yet I find no peace. And really, this whole poem is about the lack of peace. And you could talk about peace as a central theme in this poem. All of these paradoxes create this sense of a loss of peace. Another thing we should note here is that that this lack of peace is sort of pushed through with the sense of pain, I would say. This constant reference to sort of death and prison and being trapped, being prevented from rising up. This suggests perhaps also being stuck in one's bed, for example. This perish, the idea of perishing, dying, wasting away, hating oneself. We've got this, obviously that's a paradox as well, of love and hate. I feed me in sorrow and laugh in all my pain. Feeding oneself in sorrow, does one, is it saying that he eats sorrow? Is that, he feeds himself with sorrow? Or in his sorrow he eats? Which is pretty, you would think, oh well, he's sad but he's eating, okay, so what? The idea of in those days, and to some extent still today, is that if you are very sad, you typically don't eat. So that's something of a paradox on its own. And then we've got laughing in pain, and that, of course, is another paradox. So we actually have multiple paradoxes in each line, in many cases. Right. Likewise, this pleases me both life and death. And here we have our. You can't call this a rhyming couplet, but it is sort of a completion of the thought. So explicitly stating what was illustrated back here, that that it won't let me live or die at my device, and I desire to perish, yet I ask health, and so on. That it's explicitly stated here. Both life and death displease me. So sort of being trapped between the two. And a good word to know here and to have on board in your repertoire, in your vocabulary, is liminality. So this is the idea of being trapped between two spaces in a liminal space. So those of you who were in my class previously would know that liminality is sort of being trapped in between two things. Trapped in a liminal space, he is. Caught between two things. This is a big feature in literature. Mostly in modernist, sort of postmodern literature, but it's you can see it here too, and this is a long time ago. Right, okay, so being caught in this empty space. And my delight is causer of the strife. And here's our final conclusion, which re-emphasizes this line over here. I love another, and thus I hate myself. My delight, the thing I love, causes strife. This is really quite a straightforward poem overall. The language might confuse you a little bit, but as you can see, without the central aspect here is just paradox after paradox after paradox, and you can unpack each one in turn. You can also talk about once again the punctuation, for example, these pauses, slowing it down. It's very much like our other early sonnets where we have the typical unrequited love aspect, where we have a lot of caesura pauses in the middle of lines. Let's make this a particular color. Let's make it pink so it stands out. We've got commas all over the place, creating caesura, pauses in between the lines. But they're not very long pauses, one ought to note. So it's this sort of vacillating, jumping from one idea to from one extreme to the other, which is perhaps typical also of the courtly love tradition. Almost every single stanza has a caesura. Every single line has a caesura, barring these two, and almost every line has end punctuation, barring that one. So this is a pretty regular sonnet. We've got our standard sort of line structure, iambic pentameter. Everything's quite normal, except that we have all of these pauses sort of standing out, and all of these paradoxes, which make it quite unusual. No other sonnet that I've seen has quite this many paradoxes. Often there are paradoxes, usually in the last two lines, but this really takes it to the extreme, and taking it to the extreme is exactly what this poem is about. The fact that the speaker vacillates, alternates between these two extremes, with very short pauses in between. I find no peace, short pause, and all my war is done. I fear and hope. There's a long pause. I burn and freeze like ice. But of course, there's no pause at all between these paradoxes. So the fear and hope, it happens together. It's not I fear yet I hope, or I fear then I hope, but it's I fear and hope at the same time. And you can really dig into those coordinating conjunctions here. Try and explain those a bit. And all the world this season. One might expect a yet or a then, but we see yets come in later, but in the beginning it's all ands. I fly above the wind, and yet I cannot rise. That's the first time, but all the others are ands. And. So we have a lot of those aspects to it. There are some good readings online that you can take a look at. There's one, I'll actually post a video link to it. Unfortunately, the facial expressions and so forth are not very nice. They're a bit distracting. But overall, the reading is quite good, and it really puts the emotional stress into the poem. We really get a sense of the speaker's distress, which is well worth commenting on if you are going to analyze this poem. Ideally, I would recommend, if you're going to answer on this poem, that you would answer the questions that offer you a comparison. So you pick two poems to compare, for example. Then, of course, you could choose this poem, and you could choose one of the other sonnets. Perhaps you could contrast two poems. It depends largely on the question. But if you had a poem that, say, for example, this one, which is clearly dealing with the strain of the speaker's love and the distress that he feels, then you could choose another one that doesn't deal with this at all. So you could take the one by William Blake, for example, and then you could compare those two and contrast them, highlight the differences between the two, and not just look at the dissimilarities, not look at the similarities, but also look at the dissimilarities. And here's that poem by William Blake, To the Evening Star, and then of course this is really nothing unrequited at all. In fact, it's really more of an ode that's written in a somewhat sonnet-like form, and that's of course there's a humongous difference between the two. This is basically free verse, or blank verse, and no rhyme at the end of the lines. And if we compare that to our other poems, our other sonnets, that's quite unusual. We don't have the typical voltas. We don't have really anything that characterizes this as a sonnet apart from the rhythm and the 14 lines. Right, so the other thing we should look at is the differences in language. So we've got some very emphatic language, very extreme language, and then we have moments where there is a bit of euphemism. So instead of very direct, very extreme comments, we have words that are actually euphemistic or soft, sort of hidden. So live or die is as plain as it gets. It's as obvious and as direct as you can sort of imagine. Very straightforward. And then here, yet of death it giveth me occasion. Giveth me occasion is very subtle by comparison. And initially, when you read this, you probably wouldn't have even understood what this meant. And here it suggests that, well, either it's very ambiguous. That's probably what makes it soft. Occasion could mean that he has the opportunity to die, but what it really suggests, I would say, is that it perhaps makes him want to die. He wants to say, okay, this is enough, and we can support that, justify that reading with the previous line, at my device. It's not just it doesn't let me live or die. It's not of my choosing. I don't have choice in this. I'm sort of forced into this situation, and this whole thing makes the speaker look very passive, doesn't it? All these verbs seem quite passive. Seem to suggest that he has no alternative. I don't have anything in all the world I see. No, sorry. So I fear and I hope, I burn and I freeze like ice. That seems sort of active. But when he flies above the wind, which is active, and he cannot rise, well, this suggests passivity. It suggests that there's something blocking him, right? blocking his progress. Naught I have, and all the world I season. Loseth nor locketh holdeth me in prison. That this I think actually should probably be a comma. Whoops. Let me just check them up. Right. So in actual fact, this has been mistranslated on a number of websites, and the original, Wyatt's original choice of words was seize on, not season. But that is an interesting way of looking at it. Seize on is better. Seize on makes a lot more sense, because then we have the idea of possession here, and we have the idea of grabbing here as well. And here, it's important to note that Wyatt was actually translating an original Petrarchan sonnet. Many of Wyatt's sonnets here are anglicized versions. So what we do is we treat them as if they were Wyatt's sonnets, but in fact they're, well, because they are. When you translate something, it's different. The translation will never be the same as the original. And especially with the early translations, they were interesting. They were very liberal, oftentimes, in their choice of words. It's not a very direct translation. So it came to have a completely new meaning. When you read it in English, when you read it in the original Italian, it'll be very, very different. The original word here was, I think, embrace. Something closer to embrace. And embrace works well with the idea of loving another. We'll look at the original contrasted with this in a second. Right. Let me find that. Okay, so here we have the original and the in Italian on the right hand side, and we've got Thomas Wyatt's translation on the left hand side. So Thomas Wyatt's I find no peace in this case is has extra commas in it. For example, I fear and hope, comma, I burn, comma, and freeze like ice. That's interesting to note. Although, yes, whether it'll take this form in the exam or the form that we have printed is very difficult to say. So the key thing to note is, if you are writing on the sonnet alone, then you have to read very carefully in the exam. And if you are writing a comparison, well, then you can say whatever you like as long as it's quoted. So you need to perhaps be aware that there are different versions of the poem, perhaps. Maybe later on Wyatt changed it from seize on to season. It's highly possible. Anyway, the word is here, tutto il mondo abbraccio. It sounds like all of the world, all the world I embrace. Latin Romance languages wouldn't say I embrace. It would say, it would have a declension at the end of the verb. So this is the verb which would say I embrace. The declension, sorry. Not that I speak Italian, but it's very similar to Portuguese. Passa non trovo e non o da fagera. So I don't encounter peace, actually, and yet there is no war, and there is no war. E is and, incidentally. Temo e spero, and I have hope. Et ardo e son un ghiaccio. And I burn and freeze like ice, I suppose. I actually don't know enough Italian to know that means ice. I'll just assume that Wyatt was correct. Anyhow, so you'll notice that that in the Italian the rhyme scheme is quite different. So what we have here is we have an octave and we have a sestet, a CD, CDE rhyme in the end. But he followed the more modern English idea, and he had the rhyme scheme consistent for the first three quatrains, and then a couplet EE at the end. and this is, you could say that this is the conclusion of the whole thing. Death and life are both displeasing, caught between the two, and yet not really caught between the two, but wanting neither. And why? Because of his delight. Very ironically, if you are delighted, how can you dislike life and death? Very peculiar. Of course, the problem is that the delight cannot be attained. It is that unrequited love of whatever is delighted in. Okay, so this I should probably not be posting on YouTube, but if they force me to take it down, they force me to take it down. I'm borrowing this, of course, from the website queer.com, www.quia.com. If anybody wants it, it's there. Of course, it's published it's in the public domain, so that's it's difficult, I suppose, to say that one shouldn't use it, but maybe I shouldn't be using it as if it's my own. So I need to reference this. Queer.com, www.quia.com. Okay, and this is a whole section on sonnets. So this is a very nice piece. It compares the English and the Italian sonnets. So in the English sonnet, we have the three quatrains and the couplet. So we have the conclusion, often epigrammatic, and we've got the first statement of an idea, or we have the first image in a series of images, or the first point of view, perhaps on a concept, if we have 3 points of view. Often we'll have 3 statements and then a conclusion, or 3 images and then a final resolving image, or we'll have 3 points of view and a final point of view, which usually differs. Typically, the fourth one will differ. So we've established the 3 different points of view, and then the fourth one is maybe a best of both worlds, or best of all 3 kind of interpretation. Okay, and often, and usually, probably usually there'll be single sentences, although you do find that this is not always strictly adhered to. Okay, in the Italian sonnet, by contrast, we have the octave and the sestet. So sometimes it could be divided into 2 tercets, as you saw that this one has been divided into 2 tercets, but that doesn't really make a lot of sense, because then these don't rhyme. Clearly C rhymes with C, D rhymes with D, and E rhymes with E, but some people like to divide it into 2 tercets anyway. Right, so then we have an introduction to the problem, a presentation of a situation, or perhaps a question. Then we would have the solution to the problem, the comment on the situation, or the answer. Now we've covered this all already, but it's nice to have it in diagrammatic form, so you can see how it all works. Okay, I think that takes us more or less to the end of the video. I do not want to spend too much time on this, because it is quite simple. There really isn't all that much to say. You can, of course, look at the other techniques like alliteration, the F's, fear and hope, freeze like ice, lose, lock, let, live. Oh, there is one other thing that we could say about this, I suppose. Looseth nor locketh. Note that our original, as I was pronouncing it, was correct. Looseth. So spelling was a little bit ambiguous in the 1500s. Today we would write looseth. In other words, that which releases. So if I go back to this original one here, we could actually just change that and say, oops, not that one. No, okay. Oh dear, what's going on? I'm so confused. Is this caps lock on? I don't know. Oh dear. Okay, right. Looseth. That losing and locking. So that might have been a bit confusing to you without the 2 O's, but it's not losers, it's looses. There's a big difference. This one means release, and lose with 1 O is obviously to that something goes missing. Okay, right. Okay, so is there anything else here that's interesting other than that? Hold with me in prison. Yeah, holdeth but doesn't holds but doesn't holds. Hold I can, and yet I cannot escape. It doesn't let me live or die at my device, and yet of death it giveth none occasion. That's again another interesting translation. Let's take a look at the original. Nemi viol vivo nemi. Yeah, okay, so that's correct. No, it neither gives me, it lets me live. Let's actually just, I can't highlight here. Nor does it let me, impatio. My Italian's not that good. But if we assume that this is occasion, then neither gives me occasion to die. So in that case, that vastly changes our interpretation, hugely. Let's take a look. Let's go back one step. So if we change this, it giveth no occasion, and yet of death it giveth no occasion. Maybe it giveth no occasion. In this translation it said none. But you mean that completely changes the meaning, doesn't it? I mean, either way works, and of course Sir Thomas Wyatt might have changed it at a later time. We really can't tell. I really can't know this without going and digging in all sorts of historical books. But depending on the text, the option that you get in your exam, it means more or less the opposite, doesn't it? If it says giveth no occasion, well then of course we're contrasting this idea that it won't let me die. Sorry, it doesn't let me choose. So I can't. It doesn't let me live. Sorry, nor does it let me choose to die, and it gives me no option. It doesn't give me the, sorry, not an option. It doesn't give me. It doesn't pose any threats. So I won't die of natural causes. Whereas if it says giveth me occasion, well, that means something completely different. Then we go back to our original, what do you call it, interpretation. That in fact he perhaps desires to die, and that would be then euphemistic. Giveth me no occasion would not be euphemistic. So it really depends on the text that you get in the exam, as I've said before. Right, there isn't all that much left to say, so I think that's it. We'll go on with the next sonnet tomorrow. That would in fact be the next and last sonnet, which isn't really a sonnet at all, or at least is debatably a sonnet. But we'll leave that surprise for the next lesson.